This is Jennifer Pan, also known as Pan. A young Canadian Vietnamese woman and the central figure of the currently #1 Netflix documentary, What Jennifer Did, which has left audiences around the world shocked and outraged. The case of Jennifer Pan is considered one of the most shocking criminal cases in the United States in the past 15 years. And welcome everyone to Notorious Crime Stories channel, where we dive deep into mysterious criminal cases, uncovering gripping details that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last moment. If you love solving crimes and thrilling detective stories, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Notorious Crime Stories. Now let's dive into today's case. Jennifer Pan, the Vietnamese girl who hired assassins to kill her parents. On November 8, 2010, in a residential area of Toronto, Canada, the neighborhood was startled by chaotic sounds coming from the home of Mr. Han Huy Phan and Mrs. Bich Ha, a Vietnamese immigrant couple who had come to Canada as political refugees. Amid the confusion, the noises seemed to include terrified screams, desperate shouts, continuous pleas for help, and, more disturbingly, the unmistakable sounds of gunfire. As the neighbors looked outside, they were horrified by the sight of a man staggering down the street, drenched in a red liquid. His mouth barely formed broken words before he collapsed, unconscious. Without a moment's hesitation, the concerned neighbors picked up their phones and called the police. When law enforcement and medical teams arrived, they identified the injured man as Han Huy Phan, referred to as Mr. Pan from here on, the owner of the house from which he had fled. A preliminary examination revealed serious injuries to Mr. Pan, including gunshot wounds to his eye socket and shoulder, and he was now in a coma due to severe blood loss. After assessing the situation and deducing the severity of the incident, the police immediately entered Mr. Pan's house to check on his family. They were utterly shocked to find his wife, Mrs. Pan, full name Phan Bich Ha, lying lifeless on the basement floor with 3 bullet wounds to her head. Besides Mrs. Pan, the police also discovered Jennifer, her hands tied behind her back to the second-floor railing, clutching a phone that was still connected to the 911 operator. She was the eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pan, and she had miraculously survived. Upon learning that her mother had died and her father was severely injured and unlikely to survive, Jennifer couldn't hold back her grief and screamed in anguish. After thoroughly searching the entire house, both inside and out, the police brought Jennifer to the station for questioning later that night. In the interrogation video, Jennifer explained that a total of 3 unknown men had broken into her home late that evening. They had taken her hostage to threaten her parents into revealing where they kept their lifelong savings. Afterward, they led her upstairs, tied her hands behind her back, and then attacked her parents with guns. When asked about the possible motives of the attackers, Jennifer firmly stated that their goal was to rob the house. However, after reviewing the chaotic and disordered state of the crime scene, the police began to have some doubts. If what Jennifer claimed was true, that the attackers were after money and valuables, then why did they ignore valuable items like the Pan family's 2 cars, a Mercedes-Benz C-Class and a Lexus ES300, or other high-priced goods such as computers, televisions, and even visible stacks of cash around the house? Additionally, when investigating how the 3 men had entered the home, the police developed a new suspicion. All the doors and locks in the house showed no signs of forced entry. In fact, one could almost believe that someone inside the house had simply let the attackers in. When the police confronted Jennifer with this suspicion, she described as follows. It was a Monday night, just like any other Monday. That evening, after dinner, Mrs. Pan went to her dance class, returning home around 9:30 p.m. Jennifer stated that at the time, she was in her room on the 2nd floor, talking on the phone with a friend. Before going to bed, she suddenly heard strange noises downstairs. Upon checking, she discovered 3 aggressive, unfamiliar black men in her home. Before she could react, one of the men immediately attacked her, causing her to fall to the floor, and then tied her up using shoelaces. This meant that she had no idea how the 3 strangers had broken into the house. According to Jennifer's account, the men went room by room, searching for valuables. They took all the money in the house, and when they had confirmed there was nothing left to steal, they went downstairs. At that point, Jennifer heard her mother's pleading, her father's angry shouting, and the robbers' growls. Suddenly, everything went silent, followed by the sound of several gunshots. Quickly, Jennifer grabbed the phone from her pocket and frantically called the police.
Someone broke in and I heard
At this point, the police had to temporarily accept the limited clues provided by Jen. As among the 3 victims of the case, she was the only one who could be questioned at the time. Her father was still in a coma in the hospital, and her mother had passed away at the scene. However, the more Jen spoke, the more the police found her to be a peculiar and incredibly lucky individual. While the attackers could have easily harmed her, she remained completely unharmed. In fact, it was Jen who had made the call to report the crime. Yet, when the police arrived at the scene, her hands were tied behind her back. So how exactly did she manage to escape the attackers? And how was she able to use her phone to call the police if her hands were tied? With these unanswered questions, the police had no choice but to secretly place Jen under surveillance. 4 days after the incident, Jen's father, Mr. Pan, miraculously woke up from his long coma. This was a major breakthrough for the police, as they now had another witness, offering a new perspective on the case. However, Jen was the most worried person at this point. As expected, when the police interviewed Mr. Pan, they uncovered several crucial details. One of the key revelations was that he had seen his daughter calmly talking to one of the intruders. Not only that, he had witnessed her walking around with the men in the house without being tied up, unlike how she was found by the police. Yet, Mr. Pan had not exposed Jen's suspicious behavior on the night of the crime. On November 22nd, after gathering enough testimony from Mr. Pan to support their suspicions, the police summoned Jen for another interrogation. This time, she was questioned as a suspect, not just a victim. During this interrogation, the police relayed the information they had obtained from her father, Mr. Pan. Immediately, Jen broke down in tears, crying uncontrollably and repeatedly asking the police, "What exactly happened to me?" Throughout the nearly 4-hour interrogation, Jen was asked to demonstrate how she could have retrieved her phone from her back pocket and made a call while her hands were tied behind her back. Unfortunately, she couldn't do it. Using all their experience, the police successfully got Jen to admit that she had direct involvement with the intruders. However, she continued to lie with baseless claims, repeatedly insisting that while she knew the 3 attackers, her intention in contacting them was to stage a fake crime scene to end her own life due to conflicts with her parents. However, she claimed that shortly before the incident, her relationship with her parents had been resolved, and she had stopped cooperating with the men. Therefore, she didn't understand why they still carried out the break-in, and, instead of targeting her, they had targeted her parents. While the police were not entirely convinced by Jen's statement, they decided to arrest her immediately for her direct involvement in her parents' deaths. When investigating more thoroughly into Jen's family background, the police gathered some important information that helped with the case. Mr. Phan Han He was an ethnic Chinese born and raised in Vietnam, while Mrs. Phan Bich Ha was a native Vietnamese woman. The two met and became husband and wife. After relocating to Canada in 1979 as political refugees, they quickly found jobs at an auto parts manufacturing plant in Ontario. After years of living frugally and simply, in 2004, they were able to buy a spacious home in Toronto, a neighborhood heavily populated with Asian residents. Following that, their life seemed prosperous and fulfilled, as they gradually acquired 2 luxury cars for transportation. Additionally, they had saved over 200,000 Canadian dollars. With a history of hard work, both husband and wife agreed to raise their children as strictly as possible, and had high expectations that their children would achieve things they themselves hadn't had the chance to do. They enrolled Jen in piano lessons when she was just 4 years old and made her take figure skating, which she had to practice almost every day of the week. Not only that, Jen's parents hoped she would become an Olympic figure skating champion until she tore a knee ligament from overexertion during practice. By the time Jen reached secondary school, she had grown tall and was relatively attractive. She also seemed to get along well with her classmates, even becoming a flute player for the school's band. However, the increasingly strict oversight by Mr. and Mrs. Pan became so extreme that all of Jen's classmates, even the entire school, knew that she had tiger parents. Parents who monitored their child so closely that they didn't allow her any personal time or space. According to a high school friend of Jen's, her parents controlled her so tightly that while her peers were able to go to school on their own, either her father or mother would always pick her up after school. They would then drive her to various extracurricular classes. While her friends had begun exploring teenage relationships, something very normal and understandable, Jen's parents strictly forbade her from having a boyfriend. They were so overprotective that no one ever saw Jen at any parties throughout her school years, and even after she graduated from high school. With all that Jen's parents believed to be acts of care and close monitoring, they naturally expected Jen to maintain excellent academic performance. However, excelling in school requires innate talent, and Jen only showed aptitude in music, while her other subjects yielded average results. For Jen, such grades were acceptable, but she knew her parents would not agree. So, from the early years of high school, she began forging her report cards to deceive her parents, always making them proud with a perfect report card full of A's. When it came time to apply for university, it's important to know that in Canada, they don't have university entrance exams. Instead, students submit their academic transcripts, proof of accomplishments, and a few essays to the schools they want to attend. Jen was rejected by the university she applied to because, at a critical moment, she failed calculus and didn't meet the admission requirements. When she realized she had lost her chance to go to university, Jen felt partly disappointed in herself, but mostly fearful of what her parents would do if they found out the truth. They would likely lose their minds, push her to study until exhaustion, or possibly even disown her and kick her out of the house. After carefully considering her options, Jen made a bold decision. She lied to her parents, telling them she would be starting university in the fall with a sketch of a perfect future. It would begin with 2 years at university, and then she would enter a 2-year intensive pharmacy program. When the time to enroll came, Jen would pack her backpack each day, along with some documents, and leave the house, only to head to public libraries, where there were computers and internet access for visitors. For 2 straight years, Jen would leave early and come home late, constantly showing her parents how hard she was studying through old textbooks purchased from other students, and notebooks filled with lecture notes she copied from the internet. Besides her study time, Jen also sought out job opportunities, working as a waitress in a coffee shop and as a piano tutor, a job she truly loved. Mr. and Mrs. Pan seemed very happy with their daughter's study and work ethic. They even bought Jen a laptop to help with her studies. Although Mr. Pan occasionally asked about her progress, Mrs. Pan, who seemed to fully trust Jen, would tell him not to interfere and to let Jen be herself. After finishing the first 2 years, Jen moved on to phase 2 of her deception. She told her parents that the school had agreed to give her a student loan, and she even claimed to have won a scholarship worth 3,000 Canadian dollars for the next 2 years of her pharmacy program. This also meant Jen would move to the city center, where she told her parents she would live with a female friend. In reality, however, she was living with her boyfriend, Daniel Wong, and his family of Chinese and Filipino descent. Daniel and Jen had actually known each other and become lovers back in high school, where they both played in the school band. Their love story began when Daniel saved Jen during an asthma attack caused by cigarette smoke. However, due to her parents' strict control and prohibition, Jen never dared to publicly express her love for Daniel. Everything they did to maintain their relationship was done in secret. During the last 2 years of her fake academic career, Jen once excitedly fabricated a story about being accepted as a volunteer at a hospital near her school. But her parents noticed something suspicious. They had never seen Jen's uniform or ID badge. The very next day, both Mr. and Mrs. Pan got into the car and told Jen they would drive her to work. Jen tried to stay calm, and as soon as they stopped in front of the hospital, she quickly ran into the emergency department, hiding there for several hours until she saw her parents leave. By this point, Mr. Pan had begun to understand the situation. They contacted the friend who was supposedly living with Jen and were met with a flood of shocking information. This friend had no idea Jen had been deceiving her parents and thus revealed the entire truth. From Jen's failure to graduate high school due to flunking calculus to her current living situation with Daniel, everything pieced together into a perfectly orchestrated scheme. After discovering the truth, Mr. Pan was so shocked that he wanted to disown Jen. However, Mrs. Pan, out of love for her daughter, pleaded with her husband to allow Jen to stay at home. Mr. Pan eventually agreed, but with one condition. They would confiscate all of Jen's phones, computers, and other communication devices. She would only be allowed to use them under parental supervision for limited periods, and she was forbidden from seeing Daniel or going out except for her piano teaching sessions. At this point, Jen seemed to be imprisoned. Unable to endure her parents' restrictions, the couple soon broke up, and Daniel quickly entered a new relationship with another girl. This made Jen insanely jealous and nearly broke her down. As a result, Jen fabricated a story that Daniel's new girlfriend had hired people to assault and gang rape her. However, this too was exposed as a lie. From a psychological perspective, Jen felt imprisoned by the two people who should have been the ones to understand and love her the most. Combined with the fact that the boyfriend she had loved for 7 years had left her, Jen seemed to fall into a deep sense of abandonment, as if the entire world had turned its back on her. In early 2010, Jen reconnected with Andrew Montemayor, an old friend from elementary school. Jen claimed that during their reunion, Andrew told her about how he had once robbed someone in a park near his house. However, Andrew denied this when questioned in court later. Jen also shared that when she confided in Andrew about her troubled relationship with her parents, he was the one who intensified her desire for her parents to disappear. Andrew told her that sometimes he wished his own father would disappear, which only fueled Jen's imagination of a brighter future where her parents were gone. Taking advantage of Jen's mindset, Andrew introduced her to Ricardo Duncan, claiming he was someone Jen could trust to help her achieve her goal. Jen said that after giving Ricardo $1,500, he went silent. In reality, when interrogated, Ricardo stated that no such sum had been exchanged between them, only $200, which he returned after being frightened by a phone call from Jen, during which she screamed at him to kill her parents immediately. According to the police, this was when Daniel and Jen reconnected, texting each other flirtatiously every day and devising an even more sinister plan. They would hire someone to attack Mr. and Mrs. Pan, seize their assets worth over $500,000, and live together without parental interference. Daniel gave Jen an iPhone and a backup SIM card, while also introducing her to an acquaintance named Lenford Crawford, also known as Homeboy. When Jen asked how much it would cost to hire someone for a murder, Crawford told her that he usually charged $20,000, but since she was introduced by Daniel, the price was reduced to $10,000. Once the price was agreed upon, Jen carefully used her iPhone for conversations related to the murder plan, while using her Samsung phone for everything else. On Halloween night, Crawford scoped out the area around Jen's house to assess the location. The streets were brightly decorated, and children in costumes running around helped Crawford avoid suspicion. A few days later, Jen finalized the plan with Crawford and set the date for her parents' departure on November 8th. That night, before going to bed, Jen deliberately left the front door unlocked so that Crawford and his accomplices could easily enter. They headed straight to Mr. and Mrs. Pan's bedroom, where the couple was caught off guard and could only follow their attackers' orders, pleading with them not to harm their daughter. Upon hearing Mrs. Pan's plea, one of the attackers responded strangely, "Don't worry, she's a good person. She'll be fine." The rest unfolded as we know. Mrs. Pan lost her life, while Mr. Pan, though severely injured, managed to survive. During the investigation, the police arrested Jen and all those involved. They also sought out Jen's younger brother, Felix, for a statement. Through the information Felix provided, the police once again shook their heads at the reasons behind the tragedy in what seemed to be a model family. Jen was not the only child who had endured excessive control from her parents, but it appeared that Felix had the strength and confidence to gradually break free from their tight grip. In the end, for all of Jen's actions, combined with the results of a psychiatric evaluation that found her completely sane, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison, where she would have time to reflect on the consequences of her actions. In a statement written later, Mr. Pan included a final line, expressing that he still hoped his daughter would reflect on what had happened, and that she would one day become a kind and good-hearted person. Not long after, Felix also distanced himself from his father, moving far away in hopes of living the rest of his life in peace without anyone recognizing him as the sibling of a murderer. In this story, even though Jennifer Pan was truly the mastermind behind the plan to eliminate her own parents, one could argue that she was also a victim of her parents' method of upbringing. Many believe that it was Jennifer's parents who were at fault, as they pushed her to the edge of her life. What do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and click the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on our next thrilling crime story.